Hey everybody, today we are going to be talking about the Scalable Feedback Engine and how you can use it to create a supply chain around your culture of innovation. I'm Paul Austin-Manier. I'm the founder of Six Catalysts, which is an advisory and consulting firm based in Toronto, Canada. I've got a leadership background in marketing, e-commerce, operations, supply chain. It's a broad range of things that I've done over the years. And formerly, I was with smart home pioneer Nanoleaf for about a decade. Before that, I worked in ad agencies. I'm an entrepreneur. I've had two exits, one which went well and one which went the opposite, you might say. Today, I help small but mighty organizations find their footing. I really believe in the power of entrepreneurship to improve communities, and I really want to help those smaller businesses and folks who want to start businesses find their footing and grow. You can find me on all the socials. We'll post some links in the notes after the presentation. I'm a big fan of starting with why. So for me, I left Nanoleaf probably about 6 months ago, and one of the questions that I get asked often is, why not a corner office somewhere? Well, I believe that more entrepreneurs in the world means more vibrant communities. Give me a future where you have a whole bunch of small businesses serving local communities versus everybody buying all their stuff from a handful of just giant corporations. I think we're better off with having our own destiny in our control as entrepreneurs. I also have a need to build things. I'm kind of a tinkerer, kind of a builder. That's how I've been my entire career. And I'm not happy unless I've got my hands kind of dirty, my sleeves rolled up, and I'm helping people to build things. So I offer fractional leadership. I work with a very limited number of organizations as a part-time senior leader in their organization. I also provide education and mentorship and some advisory and wayfinding services for companies as well. But enough about me. Let's talk about the problem that we're kind of facing, and it's enshittification. And as I'm kind of looking at this, I realize that the screen layout is poorly chosen because there is poop on my head, but we'll move past that. When did you last feel good about most of your experiences with brands? And for many of us, it's tough to really think about when you felt good about those experiences. That's kind of a part of this problem of enshittification of companies and brands that are operating now that are established. There's some kind of things leading into that problem. There's economic transition happening right now en masse. There's a lot of disruption, there's absorption, a lot of mergers and acquisitions, and just change is happening at a very rapid pace. You've got concentration of wealth. When staff are feeling squeezed from layoffs, but they have no less work to do, relationships with customers ultimately pay the price. They suffer. And we've also got labor market turmoil, right? Layoffs, fears of AI. People are kind of a little bit hesitant about what the future will hold. So there aren't investments in customer relationships and service like there were once. C-suite heartburn is kind of another thing. There's because of all this, there tends to be rule by spreadsheet. So folks who are in senior leadership positions and they're having a tough time adapting to the changing climate, they tend to look at the numbers alone. And that leads to the optimization of really the wrong things if you want to create high quality relationships with customers and drive that better experience over time to build loyalty. That, of course, as with every problem, brings us to an opportunity. And businesses that are willing to make changes and businesses that are new, they can choose a different path. The golden opportunity, and this is good advice I find for pretty much anything about your life if you want to stand out and be successful, is do what others aren't. Like when everybody starts marketing in a certain way and using the same tactics, the same tools, it creates a herd and it becomes much more difficult to stand out over time. So the antidote is to do something else, to not do that. Another opportunity is the strategic moat that you can build if you have high quality customer experiences. You build what's hard to copy. That's really kind of the fundamental plank of building a great company that's going to last for the long term, last over the long haul. One thing that I find is that a culture of innovation is very hard to copy. A lot of people think that innovation is just a flash of brilliance. It happens by magic, and you capitalize on it forever. That's one way to go about it, but you can do what others aren't. You can choose to create a culture which generates innovation. That's the part that's hard to copy. So the scalable feedback engine, that's the opportunity that we're kind of really talking about here. This is a system that creates a path to openness, to innovate in any organization. It's really a method for systematizing and professionalizing the creation of innovation over time, and that builds your moat. On our agenda for today, we're going to go through this in the fashion of why. Why should I use this system? What is it? And how. How do I build it? How do I implement it? How do I operate it? So starting out with, why should I use the Scalable Feedback Engine system? Well, the first one is you fuel innovation. So if we think about innovation as something that is created by an engine, which rests in a supply chain, this system fuels the innovation within your organization. So the way I like to think about it is, asking for customer feedback and using it to sustain innovation they're different things entirely. And many of you are probably soliciting customer feedback today, but are you using that feedback to drive sustainable advantage for your organization over the long term? If you can absolutely say yes, then by all means, leave the session. I won't hold it against you. Another reason is to avoid fragmentation. Traditional methods of collecting customer feedback, they create fragmentation because you don't really close the loop on them. You might send out a survey and think, great, the survey is out. I'm going to look at the results when they come back. And then that's kind of the end of it. That creates a ton of missed opportunity, I've found over the years. And another final reason is to bridge silos. As a company grows, as an organization grows, silos start to form naturally because you specialize more and more. You create specialized roles, you create teams, departments, and those different groupings, they don't always talk to each other effectively. This system really helps to combat that by bridging the silos. It forces different teams and departments all across the organization to have regular conversations about the customer and about innovation. So why should I use the Scalable Feedback Engine system inside my organization? And is it for me? If you're asking yourself, well, geez, I'm a small company. I have 10 employees, and this sounds like it might be something that's too big for us. I've got good news. It's actually easier to implement this system earlier. You start small, you build the habits, and once the habit becomes second nature for your entire team and you build organizational processes around it, it grows with you. So you can get to that place where you might have 50 or 100 or 200 employees working for you, but the system has grown the entire time, and it's a part of that culture, that organizational DNA that you build. Like I said, it grows with you. Your engine's going to look different with 10 folks working for you than it will with 250 people working for you, and that's okay. That's actually kind of the point. Consistency, is more important than expertise at the very beginning. You don't have to be an expert in doing customer insights research. You just need some dedication, some consistency, and some commitment to the process and improving over time. If you can do that when you're a small company, you're actually much, much better off, positioned better to implement and make use of this system than large companies. Anyone who's tried to do a change management project at a big company knows just how hard it is. So if you start earlier, you avoid that pain down the road. So why does the Scalable Feedback Engine system benefit your customers? Well, there's the power of being heard. And I find that over time, I've found that 90% of frustrated customers are completely diffused. Their anger, their feelings go away when they felt like they've been heard. Feeling heard is really the antidote to feeling ignored in a customer service environment. And this system creates that feeling of being heard just by the nature of it running. You also bring your customers into the business. So for anyone who's familiar with the 5 Ps of marketing, a marketing mix, the fifth P is people. And we tend to think of people as our employees, our stakeholders, external partners, but we don't often think about customers being a part of that P in the marketing mix. And they absolutely are. That P of the marketing mix explicitly includes customers. So this system helps bring customers and those voices into the center of your organization. And that's a very powerful thing as you're growing. Customer centricity, it's also a well-documented success principle. There's been a bit of research by Bain and Company and some stuff coming out of the Harvard Business Review dating back to, even the 1970s, 1980s, indicating that customer-centric companies outperform their peers that aren't customer-centric over time. And Bain and Co. found that the number is quite striking. When they did a study of the S&P 500, they found that that's the kind of the popular stock market index in the U.S. For anyone who's outside of the U.S. like I am. The number was quite striking. So Bain and Co. found that on average, really customer-centric companies outperformed on revenue over a decade by 8 to 12% compared to their peers who weren't customer-centric. That's a big number. At the start, it might not matter as much, but if you think about the compounding nature of revenue growth, is it going to make a big difference to be, 10% higher in revenue when you're a mid-sized business versus a small business? And the answer is yes. Like that's going to add up to significant revenue and earnings over time if you really nail this customer-centric thing. So the system, it also benefits employees. And one of the things that I've heard from employees over time is that they also want to feel heard. The same thing is with customers. If your employees, your team, your staff, if they feel heard versus feeling ignored, they're much more focused in on their work and they're much more aligned to creating value, growing the business, and putting wins up on the board. A lot of employees tend to also really value ownership and agency. So folks who, and I found this so striking working with even accounting and finance teams, who, there aren't a lot of finance and accounting people who would say, yes, I'm a creative genius. But creativity goes beyond that, right? Most people are thinking about how to do their job better when they're doing it if you empower them. And that's very fulfilling. So this system gets everyone thinking about customer feedback. And the natural next step to that is like, okay, now that I know that customers think this about the business, what can I do about it? That's an extremely empowering, fulfilling thing for employees if they're aligned to your purpose. And they're also given that opportunity to improve. Personal growth is another factor where this benefits kind of employees of an organization. Organizations that are customer-centric tend to be a lot more dynamic. And dynamic organizations offer opportunities to their employees for growth because there are things that come up that aren't a core part of their daily job. And you float those things in front of employees and they can say, oh, geez, that's really interesting. I would love to kind of learn more about that, take that on and play a role in that. And that gives them a little bit more latitude in their day-to-day, which provides some freshness. And for a lot of folks who work for companies, that feeling of freshness is really something that they value. It makes them more satisfied with the job that they're doing and their employer for providing those opportunities. Moving on, let's talk about the what of the Scalable Feedback Engine. What is it? Before we do that, though, I want to talk about innovation for a minute. What is innovation? This is a word that gets thrown around. A lot of us kind of associate innovation as the seasoned, the only domain, or it's only the domain of giant tech companies, industrial companies that are inventing things, technology companies that are changing the world, AI companies. That's a misconception. It's not the wholly owned domain of big megacorps. Another misconception is that innovation is expensive and out of reach for small organizations. That's also not true. Another misconception is only world-changing innovation truly matters. Also not true. Some of the most powerful innovations inside an organization fly under the radar of the newspapers or social media. They're never really talked about outside of a small group of people. Here's what innovation is. You apply context, creativity, and domain knowledge to solve a problem. That's it. That's what innovation is. There's nothing mysterious about it. And once you take this definition, you think about your organization, you can say, oh, well, innovation is actually this thing that I did this morning. And it was very small, but it was impactful. Or you can say, wow, that was big. It changed a lot of things for the better for many of our customers. That was innovation. If we break ourselves out of this loop of thinking as innovation as something that's out of sight for us, then we're much better off as leaders and as an organization. So the Scalable Feedback Engine then is a system for building innovation into the culture of your organization based in relationships with and feedback from your customers. And customers can be both internal and external. It's not always about the ones who are giving you money. And that encourages curiosity and empowers people. So the Scalable Feedback Engine is a system for building innovation into the culture of your organization based in relationships with and feedback from customers that encourages curiosity and empowers people. How is it structured? Well, like any system, there is a structure to the Scalable Feedback Engine, and we'll go over the different parts in detail in the coming slides. But as an overview, it starts with an internal champion, like a lot of projects. It also includes a surveying layer. This is where you're asking a lot of the questions and you're really contacting and conversing and interacting with customers. You have an insights layer where you're taking the learnings from those conversations and you're thinking about them. You're not just like putting them into a report, but you're thinking about them and their implications for the organization. Finally, there's a communications layer. And this is the part where third order interactions happen in the system, where your champion is talking to different stakeholders in your organization about the insights that they have generated from the feedback. Let's carry on. So starting with the internal champion, what is the internal champion? This is a person. They serve as a bridge to connect different parts of the organization. I really think of the internal champion as someone who transcends teams, groups, departments. And this is, a lot easier with a smaller organization. But if you think about a large organization, this person is really kind of running around to different people in different places and having conversations. They're sharing knowledge between departments. So this is a part of where the system breaks down silos inside an organization. They're a voice for the customer. So through the nature of this work, soliciting feedback, they are advocating for the customer to be seen and heard inside the organization. We've all seen examples of organizations where that gets a little bit muddled, and some people, some teams, some leaders start to really lose touch with what's happening with customers outside of their particular silo. The champion, I find, is the most effective ones are they're curious, they're determined, and they're a bit of a sleuth, a Sherlock Holmes, if you will. Really, their purpose is to uncover hidden truths and patterns in the data that they generate from talking to customers, from having these conversations. So in short, the internal champion, they're the technician who operates your scalable feedback engine. So moving on, what's the surveying layer of the system? There's data collection inside the surveying layer. So we talk about in here you have kind of the tools, the research methods that you use to get feedback from customers, whether it's external customers or internal customers. So this is kind of things like your surveys, your polls, your one-to-one conversations, that type of stuff sits in the surveying layer. Touchpoints sit in the surveying layer as well. And touch points are the places where you're interacting with your customers, where questions can be asked. Relationships. So there can also be relationships with customers that sit inside the surveying layer. And these are the things that you can kind of like mine for gold. Often these like very close trusted relationships generate a lot of really valuable feedback that then you turn into insights later. So what's the insights layer? A bit of a segue there. Inside the insights layer, you have data synthesis. So tools used, actions taken to make sense of all the noise. Generation of insights happens here. So one thing that is very important to call out in this system is feedback that you get from customers is not the same thing as insights that you generate from that feedback. And insights are the part that is really created in this layer at this step in the process. You're transmuting that feedback and conversation into kind of those light bulb moments. And this is a process that takes quite a bit of thinking and quite a bit of conversation with people inside the organization, because it's not always apparent that a particular piece of feedback is equal to a particular insight that you generate from that feedback. They're not the same thing. You polish the insights. So this is the evaluation and thought that goes into preparing for consensus, which is something else that your internal champion is really, really important for. You have to align people towards what comes from an insight, what you're going to do about it. And finally, what's the communications layer in this system? So you've got something in here called the innovation, I call it the innovation heartbeat. And this is a pulse and a rhythm that the internal champion uses to carry polished insights out to different stakeholders inside an organization. And small company, under 10 people, it's super simple, right? Like you're basically talking to everybody. But as organizations get larger and they use this system, you have to establish a rhythm. You have to have meetings. You have to have scheduled conversations. You know, it doesn't have to be formal sit-down meetings, but even if your champion is going out for coffee before the day starts with a team lead or a particular like technical resource or a sales development resource to have a conversation about what they know, that's all a part of this pulse and rhythm. Collaboration sits here. You know, there's always going to be teamwork and cooperation that's needed to take insights and turn them into innovation, because the insights that you generate in this engine, in this system, are kind of polished evaluations of patterns and their implications of things. But that doesn't automatically equal innovation, right? You have to figure out what to do with those patterns and with those learnings, with those things that you now understand really live inside your customer base. That takes a lot of like collaboration, and that involves a bunch of different people if it's going to be effective. Empowerment lives here. Communication and motivation really are important for keeping teams going, right? So insights that are interesting, intellectually curious people on different teams will pick up on these, and they'll ultimately be motivating because they give those teams, those people, ideas about how to do their work a little bit better. And back to our agenda map, you know, we've gotten to the how part now of the scalable feedback engine. So let's talk about how to build this, how to implement it, and how to run it. So how to build your scalable feedback engine. I want to stress this. Collecting customer feedback, not the same thing as using feedback to fuel innovation. So if we think about this as a supply chain, customer feedback is kind of like your raw materials, right? So you collect customer feedback, you aggregate it, you figure things out, then you pull it into your insights layer, you think about it, you refine it, you extract patterns, and you start to determine what the implications of the feedback are. You generate insights. So that's like taking your raw materials and making a widget out of it. Then you take the widget to the wider group in the communications layer and say, how do we do something with this? How do we add more value to it for our customers? How do we improve it, make it bigger? So in this case, think of your insight as a widget, which is a component to a larger product. It's one piece of many. You want to understand your capabilities. That's important. So at the very start, when you're thinking about this system and you want to build your own scalable feedback engine, list out your touch points with customers, your communications tools, your high value relationships, and any relevant people on, your team or different teams who you want to be involved in this. And always leverage what you have. If you're already collecting customer feedback and you have systems that are working, don't throw them out the window. Figure out what's working, what you want to keep, and then kind of build it into this system with everything else, with your patterns. Turn it over to your champion. If it's working, keep it. Make it a part of what you're doing as you grow and improve. Let's talk a little bit about how to choose an internal champion. So the champion, think of them as a Sherpa. They're carrying feedback from customers, they're guiding its transformation, and they're advocating with the people who can take what you've learned and turn it into positive change, the different stakeholders inside your organization. And I want to stress right now, it kind of sounds like you have to hire a new person to be your internal champion. When you're a smaller organization, you don't, and you shouldn't. You shouldn't put the resources into a dedicated person for this role if you're like a team of 10. Rather, you want a founder or a senior executive, someone who knows the business really well, to assume that role on a part-time basis. You're absolutely going to want to hire somebody or appoint somebody full-time when your company grows. You get to the point where that makes sense. But at the very beginning, don't do it. You don't have to. Characteristics of an internal champion. So I find that the people who are most successful in this role, they're intellectually curious. They've got really strong communication skills, and they've they've kind of got like a dog with a bone mentality. When they have something interesting in their grip, they don't just put it in a folder and let it collect dust. Like they really carry it around, and they advocate for it, and they investigate, they sleuth, they have conversations, and they kind of push people to think about how positive change can come from it. Training and onboarding, this one's kind of important. When you're just starting out and you're one of your founders or a very senior kind of long tenured employee is assuming the role, the mantle of the champion, this isn't really necessary because they kind of know the organization. But if you're hiring or appointing someone who isn't as familiar with the business, job shadowing and cross training are going to really help that champion level up and be better at what they do. I find the most effective internal champions, they really know the organization quite intimately. And that's not to say that they're a subject matter expert in everything, but they know how the relationship map works in the organization. They know the key people. They know the processes. They know what the company does. They know things about the operations. They understand kind of the system as a whole, the organization. So, you don't have to kind of hire like a technical specialist to be this person. I don't think that's probably the right fit. But you do need to have the champion be really familiar with the organization's like bones. Let's talk about how to build the surveying layer now. So select your touch points at first. You want to think about where's it going to be least obtrusive to ask for customer feedback, because you don't want this to be a process that generates friction with the actual operation of your business. So think about where you can collect feedback that's not going to negatively impact customers or put roadblocks in the way of generating revenue and meeting your objectives. Choose your tools. So what are you going to use to do your surveying, your inquisition? Is it like email questions? Is it surveys? Is it like voting up downs of some sort? Pick what you're going to use. And if you're already using tools effectively, don't throw them out just because. Even if you have to modify how you use them, if it's working, if it ain't broke, don't try and fix it. Choose your questions. So what are you asking customers? And I find that you want to blend different types of questions. So you want to blend questions that really look for actionable feedback versus questions that look for kind of baseline feedback. And we'll talk about the difference between those two things in a few slides. Creating your process is also in here. So how frequently you're going to survey. How frequently are you going to report, have conversations with people? How frequently are you going to try and cherry pick insights that you can turn into innovation? Think about all that stuff and map it out, because consistency is one of the most important parts of this whole system. Now, how do we build the insights layer? Again, you want to choose your tools. So what are you going to need to aggregate and analyze data? Feedback, especially when you start collecting it at scale, you start getting a large number of pieces of feedback. You're going to need to aggregate this before it's useful. And you don't want to be doing that by hand. You want to have appropriate tools and automation in place to make that process easier, to give you a head start and a bit of a crutch on analyzing the data, which is where the insights kind of really start to form. You'll want to choose your deputies. So who's going to provide the most useful feedback as like customers and internal stakeholders, and who's going to own the creation of positive change? Your champion's going to need to form really good relationships with these deputies who are helping in the process. And also you want to create that process. So to take feedback and turn it into insights, that's going to require conversation. Your champion needs to feel kind of empowered and free to have conversations and ask questions of their colleagues inside the organization. So what's that look like? Who, what, when, how, and why? All of those questions bear some thought as you're building out your insights layer with your champion. Now let's talk about how to build your communications layer inside the engine. Again, choose your tools, common theme, right? What are you going to need to communicate your champion's findings out to the wider group? So things like if you're using Slack, you're using Microsoft Teams for communication, maybe you have a channel where all of this information kind of gets published in a real-time stream. Maybe it's more appropriate to have weekly or monthly kind of reports that go out by email. Maybe you even just kind of print something up and stick it up on a corkboard in the employee break room. Like, all of those things are communication tools that you want to think about. Choose your megaphone. So communicating your insights is kind of like tuning the engine. How are you going to do that? And this goes hand in hand with the tools question. So what tools you're going to use, but the second part, choosing your megaphone, is how are you going to use them? What are you going to publish? And then create your process. So taking insight and transforming it into innovation, that also requires quite a bit of collaboration, right? Because your champion isn't going to be the person who sits down and says, okay, we heard these 10 things from customers. We identified these 2 patterns. So I've created a new product, go sell it. That doesn't happen with one person. It requires teamwork. Now let's talk about how to operate your scalable feedback engine. So we've got your internal champion, and they're kind of at the center of everything. They're really the technician that's running this thing. They're the point person. First, they're going to ask the questions to customers. So your champion is creating surveys. They're facilitating conversations. They could just even be picking up the phone, sending emails. It really depends on your unique business, but they're the person asking the questions. That's important. They're also then mining the answers. And when you have large organizations running this system, there's kind of a team that's involved in this. But for most organizations, especially at the start, it's just one person. So that impacts who serves as your champion. They need kind of the right skills to be able to do that. So they sift through the data, they mine the answers, and ultimately they kind of create insights from the patterns that they find. And then they share those insights with different stakeholders and the wider organization. From there, you've got the innovations developing from those insights. And that, of course, is not the internal champion alone, but they are still kind of at the center of that process, because a good internal champion will be a voice of the customer. So a part of this part of the system, of the process, the cycle, is the internal champion is kind of a follow-up assertive person. They coordinate, they communicate with different stakeholders, and sometimes they chase. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Some tips on first collecting feedback. Now, here's the difference between baseline and actionable. These are different types of feedback, right? You want to collect a mix. So baseline feedback is things like tracking customer satisfaction or a net promoter score over time. Baseline feedback is typically quantitative. Baseline feedback, typically quantitative in nature. And it's things like, your NPS score is like an 8.5 in one quarter, and then it's an 8.2 in another quarter. Then it's like a 9.3, but then maybe it drops to a 6. When it drops to a 6, you want to figure out why. So these are things that kind of track the performance of the business through the eyes of customers over time. That's your baseline feedback. Innovation doesn't really come from baseline feedback, but it's still important to collect. Actionable feedback is the other type of feedback that you want to look at collecting. And it's generally very qualitative in nature. Like, there can be quantitative questions that support the case for action, but generally with actionable feedback, you're asking customers open-ended questions like, what did you think about this feature? What did you think about this product? What did you think about how this service was delivered? And how could it be better? Those types of questions are the actionable ones that ultimately your champion is going to mine, extract patterns from, turn into insights, and take to stakeholders. Feedback is not always useful. Sometimes you'll get feedback that downright sucks. It happens. Don't get discouraged. Try and think about why you got that feedback. Is there a systemic problem that is preventing you from collecting better feedback? It's not always feedback, too. Sometimes, you'll get feedback that just isn't feedback. And probably the most classic example of this is you send out a survey to a customer, they email back and say, "Where's my order?" Like, that's not feedback, right? But you can use that to build trust and loyalty with customers. So even though it might not kind of be your champion's focus, or their job, quote unquote, to kind of handle that, if they do and they coordinate with the right people inside the organization, see to it personally, and communicate with the customer in a way that is respectful, you'll build trust and loyalty with that customer over time. And that is something that not a lot of businesses, organizations are doing. So it fits into that rule of do what others aren't. And that's an opportunity. Now, some tips on generating insights. You're looking for trends. So you're not really looking for like ideas from your customers. You don't want to be asking questions like, what should we do next? Well, actually, you kind of do want to ask that question, but you're not looking for customers to do the work for you. Really, you're looking for patterns, because when you do this type of research, customers aren't always going to be able to vocalize what they want or need. Sometimes you have to kind of figure that out for yourself. You want to answer the unasked questions. It's kind of the second part of that. So insights come from really thinking about the answers that customers provide and the implications of those answers. That's where useful patterns come from. You want to choose what to champion as well. And your internal champion, they'll get good at this over time, but not all of the insights that you generate will make sense to action. They're not always going to be in the best interest of the organization and the wider customer base, and that's okay. You shouldn't build everything that a customer asks for just because they asked for it. That's a great way to misuse your limited resources. So be choosy about what your champion really brings to the group. Okay, some tips on developing innovation. The team sport. Innovation is solving problems, right? So you want to make sure that the ideas kind of flow around the organization openly, and your champion really needs to, and everyone involved really, needs to feel free to ask for help. Consensus has to be built for all of this to go somewhere that's good for your customers ultimately. Advocate for the customer. So even if you don't do exactly what the customer says, that process of listening and providing that the customers are heard, making them feel heard, has incredible value. So what they think and what they say is worth sharing inside the organization, even if it doesn't necessarily create action. It's a journey. There's this idea that innovation comes from light bulb moments, and in the garage there was a light bulb moment, and then the world changed 2 seconds later. It doesn't work like that. Innovation it's a journey. So manage your expectations accordingly. This system, using this system, using customer feedback to provide fuel for your innovation engine. It's a long journey. So settle in and be kind of prepared to be consistent and see improvements over time versus tomorrow. And like I kind of talked about before, feature requests, they don't equal innovation. You shouldn't action absolutely everything that your customers ask for, even if it seems like that's the right thing to do to keep them happy. If you spend a month creating something that's going to benefit two customers, it's likely not to have been a good investment of your time, right? And your resources, your staff. Some tips on continuous improvement for your scalable feedback engine. Just like everything else, you should treat this as something to be improved upon over time. Measure performance. So you treat your SFE like it's a product. You establish metrics that you can tie to outcomes. You track how the system is running, and then you can make tweaks to it over time to make it more effective. Tune the engine, right? That's really kind of what that boils down to. So engines that drive momentum, like cars, trucks, airplanes, whatever, those engines, they benefit from maintenance. Maintenance is kind of critical for those things to run effectively. And the scalable feedback engine is no different. It needs maintenance. It needs tune-ups to work and to be effective. Another tip is adopt flexible driving styles. So with this system, sometimes you'll need to go, and you'll need to work your butts off on collecting feedback, generating insights, and really pushing for the innovations to kind of come out, because there's some factor in the market that makes it very important for you to go. Sometimes you'll need the opposite. You'll want to ride the brakes a bit, be kind of cautious about your approach, and then try and fix anything that breaks from that stop, start, stop, start, stop, start kind of nature. So how do we get started with the scalable feedback engine? If you've got under 10 staff, typically the deployment of the engine, it's founder-led. You start small, you build on your baby steps, and you really kind of like have a shakedown. You figure out how this works, and you improve it over time. Don't expect too much out of it at the very beginning for a small team. Under 100 staff, typically, you want this to be led by someone who's senior in the organization, someone who's been around for a while. They know the business really, really well. Same thing though, start small, measure performance, build on your wins. Under 250 staff, a larger organization, at this point, you're definitely going to have a dedicated internal champion. So if you don't, and I find it's more effective in these cases to hire internally. So put up like your job posting, looking for this role, and hire internally, because they'll have a head start on really understanding the business. If you can't do that, or it doesn't make sense, then go externally and look for someone to bring onto the team. Then go through that process of job shadowing, go through the cross training, really give them probably a year, I would say, to get super, super, super useful to the business before you expect big things from the program. You're going to want to allocate resources to this, measure performance, and set goals if you're that size of an organization running this system. And if your organization is larger than that, definitely dedicated champion. You could also benefit from an advisory body at this point. That's just like kind of a council of people who are experienced in the organization, who can give advice to your champion on how to improve the program. You're going to want dedicated resource. You're going to want to measure performance, set goals. And at this point, you're also probably going to do some more complex research activities. So your champion might need a team around them. Like you'll probably want to go do focus studies with customers and spend some time like in their homes or businesses, observing how they use your products and like products. Consumer packaged goods companies are famous for doing this. Procter & Gamble is probably amongst the most successful in CPG. They send researchers into people's homes to watch how they shave, to watch how they do the dishes, to watch how they vacuum the floor. All of that type of stuff, observing without asking, it brings really interesting things into your organization. We have hit the end of the presentation, and you are still here. Thank you very much. I'm glad that you joined me today. To recap, why use the Scalable Feedback Engine? Cultures of innovation, they're really like your unfair advantage, right? Like, a culture of innovation is almost impossible to copy. So it builds your strategic moat over time. What is the SFE? It's a system for creating and sustaining a culture of innovation, because you want to build that strategic moat and you want to create that culture of innovation. And how do you do it? Well, you ingest customer feedback, transform that into insights, take the insights, and with your team, transmute them to innovation. Some parting words, and I am very, very fond of saying these things, and this is a little bit better than having, the layout poop on my head. Now there's like a light bulb over my head, so that's cool. Good businesses, they talk to their customers. Great businesses, they listen to their customers. And exceptional businesses, they bring their customers' wants and needs to the center of their operations. That's true customer centricity. And that's what this system is all about. So some next steps. I'm Paul, founder of Six Catalysts. You can go check out my website, sixcatalysts.ca/unleash2025. You can generate there your own SFE plan. I've built a little privacy-focused tool that lets you go in. It's on this landing page where the URL is, but this tool lets you go in, put in some information about your business, and it will generate kind of a starter plan for you to think about as you create this within your own organization. I don't capture an email, unless you want to send me some questions and kind of talk about your plan a little bit. The data isn't saved. It's completely private to you. Once you close the browser tab after generating this plan, like poof, it's gone. So make sure you save it before you do that. Also, everyone who's in this room, you can get a free premium subscription to The Journey, which is my podcast and YouTube show and Substack newsletter. I publish weekly. There's a whole bunch of useful stuff that comes out of that, like this. So if you're growing a business, you can get free subscription to The Journey for 6 months. That's worth about $100. And if you fancy a chat, you can also find ways to contact me directly on that landing page. I would be very, very happy to answer questions. I also offer help with implementation on this program, and I have, it's kind of like coaching, but it's more about strategic kind of problem-solving sessions for your business. There's a plan that I kind of offer around that as well. You'll find the details for all of this on that webpage.